Okay, I think I should say welcome everybody to the Shipping News on Thursdays from Stephenson Harwood. Today's topic is called Keep Calm and Carry On, some practical guidance on managing the aftermath of a casualty. My name is John Simpson. I'm a partner with Stephenson Harwood in Singapore. So it's 4 p.m. where I am, but I understand it's quite a bit earlier where my colleagues are in London. We have from Stephenson Harwood, Nick Barber, who is our lead casualty partner. He has handled numerous casualties over the years, and I believe he has a particular specialism in relation to casualties on container ships, but he has, of course, handled casualties on all sorts of ships. We're also lucky enough to have Rod Johnson, who is a master mariner in our team, who I find very useful whenever I have any technical questions that I want to ask. Rod has also spent time with the British Coast Guard, so he has great experience in relation to casualties. And finally, Sam Kendall-Marsden has very kindly agreed to join us as a special guest. Sam is Director of Claims at the Standard Club. He is also the head of casualty and has a great deal of experience in connection with wreck removals. I've been given a very ambitious list of topics which the panel are going to discuss, and I understand they had a very lively discussion earlier in the week. So I may not need to intervene very much, but I've got a long list of pointers. So I'd better not carry on speaking for too long, because I think they have plenty of ground to cover, and I will pass on to the team in London. The team in London need to be unmuted, though, before they can continue with the debate.
There we go. How's that? Can you hear us, John?
I can hear you now, and I'm sure all the participants can. Thank you.
Hopefully we've had our glitch for the team now. So.
That was our casualty.
That was our casualty.
There
we are. There we are. Yeah, I thought the first thing we probably want to talk about is trends in casualties we've seen lately. Obviously, the ground has changed somewhat in terms of volume of traffic, possibly maintenance to some extent. We've had the sulfur regulations coming into force, which made a big difference. So yeah, sort of trends in marine casualties. I think Sam, you've seen some emerging, haven't you? Certainly from our point of view, we're seeing more bunker claims naturally and main engine damage claims, which are sort of leading on to knock-on effects. Apart from that, collisions about the same, possibly small groundings, but I'd be interested to hear your experience.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back over the last few years and the pool claims that have arisen, there's been an increase in claims involving container ships, and some of those have made the news. The Ever Given that we've seen. In terms of the greatest exposures for P&I clubs, groundings is a significant area, and that's driven mainly by pollution and wreck liability. So that's where the the main exposure is in terms of individual casualty type.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that I mean, the number of, certainly I think it's been mildly celebrated in the press, the number of total losses seems to be going down. But actually, I think what's really happening there is the background level of, if you like, I'll call them minor casualties for the sake of this discussion. Yeah, blowing a generator up is obviously quite traumatic at the time, but things like generator losses, main engine damage, minor shunts, contacts, collisions, that sort of thing, that's staying at around the same frequency. And I get a sense that it's because they're not hugely disruptive. Yeah, it's centered on the ship. It's dealt with in a very transactional way. But we're seeing the number of total losses going down, but the consequences going up. So what we're increasingly, I think, working towards is a low frequency, high consequence pattern of loss. And I think that does two things. And the thing I worry about most is you can have quite a successful career in shipping now and never, ever come across a major casualty. So if you are unlucky enough to be in any decision-making when you have a casualty now, this could be a career first and possibly career limiting experience. And I do worry about the kind of things that people do in the heat of the moment that resonate for the years that follow when we're dealing with casualties. And I wonder about the, if you like, the frictional losses that sort of inexperience might generate. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's a good point, because it sounds slightly counterintuitive, but not so long back, I think we had a very good cohort of people who unfortunately dealt with a great deal of casualties.
Yeah.
They're actually quite practiced, and it was almost second nature. I think to some extent we're losing that, certainly within the owners and charterers, losing that capability. But of course, the guys in the clubs and hull machinery insurers too, I think, see far more than most people, of course. And probably, I think the skill set is now less centered on the commercial end and slightly more in the insurance end. So I don't know whether you find that in terms of managing a casualty with a member that you find, and this may not be a question you want to answer, but whether you find that, that it's less of a interaction of people with similar levels of experience, and you're finding that you have to lead a bit more and support the member in that way.
I mean, it's a challenge for the clubs as well, because one of the themes in recent years has been about the decline in Lloyds Open Form. There are far fewer Lloyds Open Form cases now than there were in the past, and not all of those cases will be scopic cases. So even within the clubs and the legal community, you have the same challenge. You're right, though, on the owner's side. I mean, we hope our members don't have these casualties at all. But one of the things that we try to do is to engage in drills with them before the fact, so that we've then identified who would be involved in the event of a major casualty, and try and bring up the level of knowledge within the members' offices in relation to the sorts of issues that they're going to encounter. If you think about what they are, typically something will go wrong. A ship might run aground, or there might be a fire. And somebody within the ship owner's office will often have to make a decision at a very early point. It might be about which contract to use, for example, which contractor to go for. And so unless they're tooled up with the requisite knowledge at that point, then they may find that quite a challenging process.
Sure. I guess that's where you guys come in pretty early. So it's interesting.
In terms of the decline in the use of Lloyds Open Form, do you find that modern communications are such that the master is less likely to agree on a salvage contract without first consulting very heavily with a number of people outside the vessel before who aren't there seeing what's going on before concluding a salvage contract?
Yeah, I mean, John, I'll pick that one up. I think it's kind of the curse of instant communications, and I'm old enough to have been at sea right the way from when we used to leave, and nobody would know we were alive or dead until we got to the other end. It was blissful. To the world of instant communications, where you had the office at you every 6 minutes, constantly, day and night. And I think where we tend to get to now, John, is exactly that. It's kind of I wouldn't go so far as to use words like infantilization, but it can feel like that when you've got somebody in command of the ship who's actually welded to the telephone in a casualty talking to the office, whilst decisions are being made from thousands of miles away, where in fact I still believe, as a crusty old mariner, that those decisions should be made on the bridge, and masters should be empowered. In the end, I think it saves cost and time. But yeah, I think it's true enough, John. You can get I've seen it many times when masters have got bogged down talking to their offices about what's going on and what's the best contract. And I think to an extent you can overthink it. Although, yeah, I do get the idea that LOF doesn't always, it starts well, but can sometimes finish badly. Nick, you see that, haven't you?
Yeah, I think that's true, because in a sense, LOF remains the gold standard. If everything's going wrong and you don't quite know how it's going to develop, and you generally don't, I think the LOF is, you're going to do okay. If you sign that, then what happens next will follow as well as it can, I think, probably. But there is that sort of tendency. I know you've been involved in some of the sort of drafting of or reviews of the standard form contracts that aren't LOF. There is that sort of slight tendency to be reluctant to commit to that. Basically, you sign an LOF, of course, you hand over your ship to Salvage effectively, and they're in control. And I think there was a reluctance to do that now, and people are a bit wary, and they're looking for that more structured contractual kind of response. And I think the difficulty there is that, you know, in a casualty, when you really don't know what's going to happen next, you can find yourself in a, you know, sort of locked into a contract which really doesn't work for the situation. And first and foremost, I mean, it's not the financial aspect, it's the crew, the property, the environment, and they're the things you have to think about. And I think LOF does that very well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the position of the group clubs is that LOF is the best emergency response contract for the reasons that, you know, you've touched on and that people understand. And we have seen this resistance to its use in recent years, and the concern from our perspective is if that then means that there's a negotiation for some other form of contract and that then leads to delay, the situation could get worse. There could be pollution, it could end up in a wreck removal. And aside from environmental damage, that, you know, there's also the potential for increased costs, which falls on the insurance market. I think that the concerns of the property market are probably twofold. It's the perceived uncertainty about how the salvage reward is assessed under Article 13 of the Salvage Convention, and then it's the size of the award. And I think, you know, odd awards, and I mean odd in terms of standout rather than odd in its literal sense, have caused some concern. I think there's work to be done in terms of educating people within the industry in terms of how those rewards are assessed. But, you know, actually, if you look at the ISU statistics, I think the average reward is about 9% of sale values of the ship and cargo. It's about $1.5 million, which is a lot of money, but it's not a huge amount of money in this particular context, particularly not when set against what might happen if things worsen, as I say.
Yeah.
And of course, you've got the better apportionment of risk with the LOF, haven't you? Particularly when it comes to cargo's contribution.
Yeah, I think that's true. The great thing in a sense about the LOF, of course, that all of the interests have to contribute to the salvage security pro rata to their financial interest in the venture, and that works very well. Whereas with a lot of the standard form BIMCO contracts, which are very good in their own way and for their own things, of course that's not the case, and the burden falls on the ship owner. And as a sort of a side issue, something that may come into play, coming back to your point about the instantaneous communications, is that historically, of course, the master could bind the interests on the vessel as an agent of necessity. Whereas these days, if people are looking a bit more closely at, you know, what is the right contract, what do we need to do, and with the LOF remuneration being so uncertain, you know, there is scope for that question about, well, was it really necessary to sign an LOF? Did you have to sign on to that effectively open-ended liability for costs? So I think that might be another thing that's sort of playing in some people's minds.
Just on that point, how sympathetic do you find salvage arbitrators are in circumstances where the master is in jeopardy and makes a decision which may, with hindsight, not be seen to be quite correct, but I'd be interested to hear your experiences about that.
Generally, I'd say very sympathetic. They're practical people, lawyers generally, but practical people, but they understand how it works. And so there is a high degree of sympathy there. But they do, I mean, it's written into the salvage arbitration clauses that, they're all standard clauses. The owners do have to cooperate with the salvors. So it's not, yes, they recognise the pressure, but they do expect to see a high degree of cooperation with salvors as well.
I think, do you think that one of the issues though is that there are far fewer salvage arbitrations these days than there used to be,
and no themes developing from them?
Exactly. I mean, possibly, so when cases are settled, people don't always know about that. Maybe there could be some means of sharing that with the salvage arbitrators so that they can then reflect on current issues.
Yeah. Do you think it's a trust issue, Sam? I mean, have salvors somehow lost the trust of owners? Is that why salvage on terms is becoming more popular? I mean, I'll just throw that out there, but
I think it's, when you look at the shipping industry and the parts of it that are involved in a casualty situation, you've got the ship owner, a broker, often. You've got the property underwriters, hull and machinery, and then property underwriters for the cargo, and then you've got the P&I club. There's a lot of interest to try and coordinate. what we've tried to do recently, particularly, is to build a better relationship with the property insurance market through the JMCC, and to try to put in place some guidelines on casualty response so that there's much better engagement at an earlier stage to build the trust between those parties. I think there's a good relationship between the International Group of P&I Clubs and the ISU, and we have regular contact on various issues. And then through that, we're trying to support the owner in terms of the choices that they need to make in those early stages. I mean, I've speculated about what the barriers to the use of Lloyds Open Form might be, but what we've done within the international group is launched an initiative that Hugh Shaw, the former SOSREP, is spearheading. He's going out and talking to a whole range of parties to try and find out what the barriers to the use of Lloyds Open Form are, so that once we then have that understanding, we can come up with some solutions to try and address its decline.
I wonder if Hugh's going to talk to himself about the role of the coastal state. Yeah, because I also get a sense that you look at I can read a few off, but my favourite is the Ever Given. You know, the role of the coastal state in blowing the whole thing sky high into somewhere else, some other territory that we've never been in before. I know it started with how clean is clean with rent removal, but some coastal states are really quite muscular in the way that they choose to intervene before, in my view anyway, before the proper process has had time to really settle down and start to do what it's supposed to do.
Also with varying degrees of technical competence. I mean, some coastal states are very good. They know, they've been through it, they know what's going on. Others, of course, feel the need to be involved, but without necessarily any great sort of fund of knowledge behind them to inform their response. I do wonder if with LOF as well, whether the Article 13 criteria, which are, if you sort of backtrack slightly, of course, LOF was supposed to be a relatively quick and dirty sort of way of resolving the Salvage remuneration, and the key point, of course, was that it took the debate about cost out of the response, and it just let the Salvage get on with the response. That was definitely a good thing. But I wonder if now, because there's so much experience in the application of the Article 13 criteria, which of course fixed the Salvage remuneration, absent scopic, within the sort of the salvage sort of practicing community. We understand that, but I'm not sure necessarily some of the stakeholders understand. So they get an award at the end of it. It's tremendously hard to link the size of that award for the Salvage with the service performed. But if you go through the criteria, there's different things given different weight and a huge amount of experience behind it. And I'm not sure that link between people, sort of say, look at the owner getting their benefit in their property back and cargo. I'm not sure they can easily identify the link between that and what it costs to do that.
No,
a bit vague.
No, that's a bit like me and builders. I always massively underestimate what it's going to cost to have something done. But container ships, though, I mean, where you've got, you talked about cargo interest there, where you've got a whole range of subcharterers and then cargo owners, and often nowhere to put distressed boxes. I often wonder if it's not, and again, I'll just be mildly provocative here, I often wonder if it's cargo interests and the way that they're, particularly container ship casualties, that they are somehow making the aftermath of an LOF less easy to deal with, shall we say. I know you and I have had some experience of that with the that was a Panamax-sized box ship, wasn't it? The MSC Chitral, they wouldn't allow the containers, the Indians wouldn't allow the containers to be landed ashore, so they had to be put on flat top barges. And I've seen cases where the salvors have had to use the ship itself as storage for the cargo. So how do we feel about that? Is that a container ship's a special case? Does LOF apply as well?
I think they certainly present special challenges. I mean, if you imagine an Ever Given type scenario that got worse and developed into a wreck removal and a large-scale container removal operation, that would be a very challenging undertaking. And actually, if you look at some of the big in terms of value container casualties that we have seen, the MSC, Napoli, the Chitra, Rod you mentioned, the Rena as well.
Yeah.
All three of those cases featured relatively small container ships, less than 5,000 TEUs. If you had one of the very large container ships, 24,000 TEU carrying capacity, and had to somehow find a suitable port with suitable equipment, with suitable draft, and the means of offloading, storing containers, possibly de-stuffing, cleaning cargo, restuffing, on shipping to final destination. I mean, in the news right now, we're hearing about severe congestion at a number of ports, Felixstowe, Los Angeles, for example. You know, and that's when things are running relatively normally, albeit in the post-pandemic environment, mid-pandemic environment. So if you had a casualty environment as well, where, you know, perhaps the ship was over on its side and the cell guides are all out of whack and containers swollen and water drenched, it will be incredibly challenging. So does it work for that? I mean, I suppose you could segue into a discussion about general average as well in that very large container ship context as well.
I was going to suggest that you that you go on to general average, but you've beaten me to it, Sam.
Well, let's do it now then.
May as well do it now.
Yeah.
Yes. But it's I mean, obviously, general average is its own slightly esoteric art in some ways. There is certainly what we find is obviously you have your Antwerp rules, which are great and very helpful. You have your bill of lading and your charge party, and that's all great. The interaction between the two, and so many of the questions that we see are not necessarily legal, although they're directed to us. They're really adjusting questions, and it can become very difficult. But I think with declaration of general average, certainly as a matter of English law, there's no real magic to it. There is no formula, as long as there's nothing in the charge party, which would be very unusual. So it's an easy process to get going, but it's something that you have to do with some appreciation of what follows, and that can be a long, drawn-out, horrendous process. And I mean, obviously, there's the club's position on cover for unrecovered GA, and you have to bear in mind that the cargo interests now, almost as a matter of course, I think, raise a Rule D defence, however speculative that might be. And the trouble is, of course, that even though it's speculative, it immediately puts the burden of proof back onto the owner to demonstrate that it wasn't their fault in the first place. So that makes the GA harder. And another point that we've seen as well is that, particularly with slot charterers on ships, they of course have their own GA claim. They're creditors in GA, so they have their own sort of angle on it. And so even if the ship is unseaworthy, it's written into the York Antwerp rules, that does not terminate the GA process. It's still a GA, and there is still a GA. And there may still be creditors, but without the input of the owners quite so much. So and especially with the so many cargo interests in a container ship, it's it gets messy and expensive quite quickly.
That's the thing, is it's the magnification of the problem with the volume of interest in cargo, and then the interplay with GA security, salvage security.
Yeah.
But unless and until someone comes up with a better mechanism, then I think that's what we're going to do.
I did a job with Nick, and I was really surprised, probably naively, about how much of the cargo was uninsured. So when the call went out for security, there was a significant amount of the cargo that was just no response at all. And whether the shipper had just said, well, that's it, we'll never see that container of welding powder ever again. Even though the shell is obviously owned by somebody, I was surprised by that just how much cargo is uninsured.
Well, you also sometimes receive phone calls from individual cargo interests. In one of the casualties we talked about, somebody rang up and inquired about their antique piano. Container reference. I thought, well, it could be some issues with the tuning there.
Yeah.
Yes, I imagine if I was shipping my home contents and there was an incident and I was called on to make a GA contribution and I was uninsured, I would be a bit miffed.
That's exactly the point, John. I think the big institutional ones that are insured and so on, it's relatively, they've been there, they've done it, they know the drill. But if you got some poor soul who's transporting their furniture from Australia to the UK, they've paid for the carriage, they've entrusted somebody with their goods. whoever they've been entrusted with the goods for whatever reason, they're not there anymore potentially, or they're damaged, and then they've got to pay for it. It's it's conceptually it's a very hard thing, I think.
It's very hard to sell, isn't it, to somebody who isn't it?
It is, but I mean, then beyond that, if they have the claim from the contractual carrier, they've then got to overcome liability and limitation. And,
I've heard some pretty sporty sums bandied around now for the cost of shipping a box. It's gone from $2,000 to, I've heard numbers as high as 30 bandied about. Now, whether that's just overheating in the press, but I certainly know it's got to 18, 20 in some cases. That seems to me that things that are being shipped now are low volume, high value. So if we had one today, then that really could be a very expensive proposition once we get to the cargo plan, couldn't it?
Yes.
Yes, and I mean it would depend. I mean there might be an issue as well if the the carrier had waived rights to limit, for example, although that would have cover implications. I mean, in case we've seen in the past with lower cargo values, they've still caused problems. So the Chitra, for example, there was a lot of recycling material, low value, but caused all sorts of problems with pollution. So there wasn't a great cargo liability in the sense of cargo claims, but other liabilities as a consequence of the carriage of that. But you're right in terms of the individual high value cargoes that we see now, electronic gadgetry and so forth.
Yes, I think the whole who would be an average adjuster really? Fortunately, they're the ones who have to deal with the collection of the GA securities before you move on. I think it would be quite interesting as well. You've spoken quite extensively about the different forms for salvages, but it would be interesting to hear when does a salvage become a wreck removal, and your thoughts about wreck removal issues.
Yeah,
everybody looked at Sam.
There you are. I was about to go. Over to you, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, this is, when we receive imagine if you're the P&I claims handler and you receive a notification, a ship's run aground, and your initial thought is that that's a salvage operation because the ship owner wants to get their asset to a place of safety, inspect it, repair it, hopefully, if necessary, continue with the voyage, deliver the cargo. And provided that that is the case, that will be a salvage operation paid for by the property underwriters. But sometimes things don't work out like that. Things get worse. The damage to the ship is worse than than perhaps feared, and the cost of salvage and repairing the ship will exceed the insured value. So it effectively becomes an insurance write-off, a constructive total loss. And at that point, the ship owner will commonly tender a notice of abandonment to the hull and machinery underwriters to collect under the policy. They would then typically reject that notice of abandonment. And at the same time, the maritime state authorities concerned about a wreck in their territorial waters would commonly issue a wreck removal order. So once you've got those three ingredients, the CTL, the notice of abandonment, and the legal liability on the part of the ship owner, that then triggers the shift from salvage to wreck removal, from hull to P&I, and the P&I cover would then respond to wreck removal liabilities.
Yeah, that makes sense. I suppose one of the issues under the Nairobi Convention is that, that in terms of definition of wreck, it's very much focused on sort of stranding, the risk of stranding or grounding, or sinking. But of course, a vessel can effectively be a wreck before it reaches that stage. And I suppose at that point, that's where you look at sort of the mitigation measures that they can order, if necessary, in order to make sure that wrecks are dealt with. But the other issue, I suppose, under the Nairobi Convention, of course, this comes back to container carriage, is the definition of wreck, which of course includes cargo. So things lost overboard in containers, whether floating or sunk. And we have I think you were going to talk about the right of direct action when you're on, because that exists, but against the owner.
Yeah, or the club.
Basically, the insurer, but the owner's insurer, yes, but not necessarily cargo.
That's an interesting one because I've dealt with some success very recently with funding like a tow wire that was dealt with as wreck by the UK and dealt with very sensibly. because you get into the point with Nairobi where the measures to recover have to be reasonable. The state can't just insist. But we knew what the object was. But what if it's a couple of containers that may contain something hazardous, and they're in fairly deep water? It wouldn't be unreasonable for the state to say that needs to be removed. You've got to find it first, and then you've got to remove it. In some way, the convention does allow for direct action against the club, and of course the flag state can issue. What colour card is it?
Blue.
It's blue, yeah. Green, blue. No. It's blue colour. But how does that sit with you? Because you could end up looking down the barrel of a really large sum of money to pick up what is, a small amount of cargo is wrecked.
You could. I mean, the international group clubs support the International Liability Convention regime, whether it's Nairobi, CLC, Bunkers Limitation Convention. And I think the trade-off at the heart of all of them is strict liability versus direct action, and also, though, the ability for clubs to limit their liability, limit their financial liability. I think the inclusion of cargo within the definition of wreck in Nairobi is a definite advantage, because if you don't have that, that does then create problems when you have lost containers. Yes, potentially large liabilities, questions about what's reasonable and proportionate, and I think over time what we're going to see is the bar being raised in terms of the level of expectation of authorities. So you'll see things on the seabed that in past years authorities might have allowed to remain, now won't be allowed to remain. And you've got the hazard criteria as well in Nairobi, which I think is a useful expression of the position, and it should promote better consistency. But I think that ultimately this will lead to higher wreck removal costs over time for the clubs, and they are exposed with direct action. But having said that, it also promotes certainty. We know what our members' liabilities are in different states across the world. We know what the financial exposure is. We can then factor that into our underwriting calculations, so that we then underwrite on a break-even, sustainable basis in the future.
Okay. Well, I think that must be absolutely right about raising the bar, because we now have a precedent, don't we, with the, I'm not sure I'm allowed to mention it, but the vessel that lost a lot of containers off the coast of Holland a couple of years back. And some of them sank, some of them didn't, some of them washed up on the beach. But basically the way the wreck removal operation progressed was it was a number of offshore support vessels with side scan sonar just combing the seabed for everything, and they found all kinds of stuff down there. And of course you don't know exactly what it might look like a container, but you don't know how old it is until you've gone and had a look at it.
Yeah.
But all of this is cost over weeks. So.
Yeah, just exactly that. All those spare targets. Yeah. And of course in that part of the world, some of it's liable to explode.
Yes.
So,
well, the other challenge that we've seen in recent casualties are these little plastic nurdles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Escape from containers and foul beaches.
Yeah.
And that's another challenge.
Tremendously hard to clean up.
Well, it's interesting. I was funnily enough on a beach not so long ago on holiday, and there were some environmentalists that had this little sieve thing, and they invited the children to throw sand into it, and they span it around, and all these nurdles fell out.
Yeah.
We were just on a beach, and I said to the young people who were operating this, I said, how deep is this going? They said, well, we've dug down 4 or 5 meters, and we're still finding them. So the whole beach was riddled with nurdles. It's almost uncleanable.
Yeah.
Which takes us to the how clean is clean point with wreck removal.
Yeah.
And I think it was the how did I forget the name of the passenger ship that hit Italy?
Costa Concordia.
The Costa Concordia. Yeah. Grief, I'm getting old. But I mean, that I think that was our latest outing in how clean is clean, isn't it? Because that had to be. They even insisted the ship was moved in one piece.
Yeah.
With the cost drivers that went in there.
Yeah.
I think, and that's my prime example of the coastal state really driving cost into a wreck removal, because otherwise you could just cut that up with chains and take them away in bits.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. At the risk of digressing ever so slightly on that one, it might have been a presentation from you. But wasn't there there was some clams on the seabed, giant clams, and the coastal state required those to be uprooted, put in a new nursery somewhere, and then brought back after the wreck removal was complete. slightly flippant point, but the cost was astronomical, and then they all died.
You're referring to the Pinna Nobile. I probably mispronounced that.
Oh, really?
Oh, right.
But there is a much greater focus now on the back end of an operation than there once was. So on the Concordia, the wreck has gone. The wreck has been recycled. All of the debris and sediment that was emanated from the wreck and was produced by the operation, all of that's gone. And we're now 2 years into a 5-year environmental program to restore the seabed to its former condition. We've got some scientists from the University of Rome engaged in that, and a coral reef expert also from Florida who supports that work. And the authorities inspect that on an annual basis, and we expect to complete that in spring 2024. And it involves replanting coral, replanting seagrass, doing what we can to restore the seabed. And I think that in the future, in other cases, just as with that one, the requirement will be to restore the seabed as best as can be achieved. Although I think it needs to be tempered with some measure of reasonableness and proportionality, because the sustainability of the international group arrangements, as I said, depend on a number of interrelated factors. Yes, strict liability, direct action, but yes, reasonable compensation and the right to limit. That's an important part of it.
Yeah. In that regard, I think the international group has got a program where it's seeking to sort of set up relations with coastal states and make sure there is sort of an element of trust there and understanding of how the process works.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we conduct casualty reviews every 3 years. We've conducted 3 of them so far in 13, 16 and 19, and we've got another one coming up next year. And what we try and do is identify the cost drivers in the big casualties we see across the group, and then distill the learning points from them and come up with recommendations that we disseminate to the clubs. And one of them was this point about outreach, engaging with maritime administrations, talking to them about how we're responsible underwriters who want to do the right thing in a sustainable way. And this initiative involves us engaging with states across the world. The UK is one of them. New Zealand, for example, South Africa, various states in South America. We're talking to others at the moment, Australia, and it's founded on a non-binding MOU on casualty preparedness and response, and then supported by training. So I think New Zealand is quite a good example. We've had an MOU in place with them for a number of years, and we've just finished a session of training modules, not just on casualty response, but also pollution as well.
Sure.
And we've got very good relations with the New Zealand government, just as we have with governments in the other countries, so that if an incident were to occur, we wouldn't be getting to know each other from the standing start.
Sure.
And we would already have an idea about how we would behave and who the relevant stakeholders would be. So, the idea is that it improves the quality of the response, but it also means that our interests as an insurer are considered in the process as well.
Yeah. How does that work for small island developing states, Sam? Because I've seen a lot in the press about the disadvantages of SIDS and the fact that they seem to be scattered around the world's shipping lanes. But is that outreach program, are you getting to them as well?
Yes, so Australia and New Zealand in particular are good at this in supporting Pacific Island nations. We've been hampered to some degree by COVID and the inability to travel, but those countries, also France with islands as well, they also support. And so through those countries, we'd be seeking to broaden that out and support those island communities as well. It's difficult to do it on a per country basis at that level, just because there are so many potential places.
Yeah.
So you've got to sort of concentrate your attention where it's going to have the most effect. But that's the idea there.
And from your experience at the coastal state end, what would you be looking for, I think, in particular from an owner and their club in the event that there was a potential pollution incident or ground?
Well, so I can tell you from personal experience, it gets very political very quickly. So behind whoever is representing the state are a whole list of politicians, large and small, at the local level and the national level, all of whom are keen to see somebody in the frame for paying for it. There's going to be some chatter about shipping as a source of pollution. There's going to be some unhelpful stuff. I mean, if you remember the Napoli, it was a really brave decision to throw that onto a Dorset beach, and exactly the right thing to do. But the nausea that caused locally was tremendous. And I think it's taken time for people to realise that had that ship been pushed out to sea, the damage would have been immeasurably worse.
And we've seen that happen.
Yeah, of course we have. Yeah. So I think from the coastal states' perspective, there needs to be, from owners and clubs, transparency. I think that's what really helps. They need to be present. We need to be able to say, as the coastal states, and I'm reverting to type here, that yes, we've identified the owner. It's not some shady brass plate in the Cayman Islands who've all done a runner. It's not that. These are reputable owners. Look, here are the insurers. Yes, it's all going to work out. I know it looks horrible at the moment, but it's all going to get better, and we're going to. And then you start managing people's expectations and damp down the noise. If you don't get that, so if you've got you do have a shady owner behind a brass plate in the Cayman Islands somewhere, and people are less certain about stepping forward, you have got the right plate, it can be much more difficult. And in the absence of that reassurance, you will find most coastal states being much more interventionist than they otherwise would, because they know that if they don't exercise a high level of control in that uncertainty, the whole incident will run away from them. And politically, that's bad news.
We saw a number of cases that were leading up to the formulation of the IMO guidelines on places of refuge, the EU guidelines. I think it was the Castor, wasn't it, that was towed around the Mediterranean for about a month.
Yes.
Finally found somewhere. Yeah. So we sort of moved from that to a position where hopefully the eventual outcome would be better. But you can appreciate why a coastal state wouldn't want a stricken ship, potentially polluting right on their doorstep. But it's trying to overcome that, isn't it, for the best holistic solution.
It is, and often that refuge ends up as being a port, and there's a little bit of a dance that's done between states and ports about who's going to be liable if a berth gets blocked. We had that. I was the incident commander for the Decent back in 1999, I think it was, and that ship was taken to Rotterdam in the end to have the fire put out, and the cargo removed. And there was quite a bit of negotiating with the Port Authority to get it towed off the bank that we'd thrown it on in the English Channel across to the same story with the Flaminia. But it can be done. What tends to happen is that the Harbour Authority will want the state to accept liability. That's what they'll want to happen, and then the state will be turning around. Yeah, exactly.
I have to say, I find your internal experience of all of this fascinating, Rod. I've also experienced it from the other side, trying to work out where a ship can go into as a port of refuge. Although it does seem to be becoming more sensible now. We've reached just beyond our 40-minute time allocation. And I think that you've covered all of the points which you set out in the note that you gave to me in advance, and it's been fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. The only one thing which I think you haven't mentioned is your philosophical point about reputable insurers and possibly substandard tonnage. And I think we might have a couple of minutes for you just to comment on that. But in addition, we've had a question from the audience, which relates more to the earlier discussions about LOF and so on. And the question is this. A question probably a bit academic for the morning. Despite what the judges said in the Renos, do you think SCOPIC is there to deal with environmental damage, or is it part of the LOF to save properties? So is SCOPIC there just to deal with environmental damage, or is it part of the saving of property?
It's here's a lawyer's answer. It's both. Initially, of course, it was environmental damage because it was put in place because Article 14, which was directed at the situation where a Salvage had exercised their best endeavours, and nevertheless there had not been a successful result. There could be pollution and so on. So it's to make sure that they got some degree of compensation. But that was far too cumbersome, and it simply didn't work. So Scopic was brought in partly as an answer to that. So it's kind of origins are environmental, really, but I think probably your experience too is that we see more and more Scopic is invoked because it has been incorporated in the first place and then invoked before it has any effect at all. It's invoked really to give salvos a bit of a safety net, so that, you know, if they, even if the project goes reasonably well, if they think their Article 13 award might not be quite what they hoped for, then they may well invoke Scopic. So it's a bit of both, really, would be my view. I don't know if anyone disagrees.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's exactly that. I mean, when a salvo invokes Scott, I mean, it's almost invariably incorporated. I'm not saying Godfrey hasn't been, but it's basically because they've got two concerns. It's that the operation might not be successful, and Lloyds Open Form being no cure, no pay, they don't get paid. And if they've got a concern about the sale values, as you know, as you've said, for us, it's quite a good early tripwire because, you know, it suggests that actually it could be something that might not be successful, and therefore could come to us as a rep removal.
Yeah, I think the Wacky Share was a classic example of Scopic in action. Yeah. And why you trigger it.
Thank you very much. I hope that answers the question. It sounded pretty comprehensive to me. We don't have any more questions, but you might want to, since you raised it with me in advance, you might want to have a little look at reputable insurers and substandard tonnage, and then, unless there are any other questions from the floor, then we can wrap it up.
Okay. Might be squarely you, Sam.
Well, thanks, Nick. As a reputable insurer,
Exactly.
I mean, I think we can act as a force for good, the insurance community. The clubs within the group have a focus on loss prevention. So obviously we expect all the ships to be appropriately classed and to be running the right way. But we also inspect a percentage of the ships, of the club's entered tonnage on any given year, which then informs our understanding of the risk. And if there are issues identified as a result of that, then we might impose terms on the insurance that ship benefits from. But it's more a case of encouragement, encouraging ship owners to behave in the right way, in a safe way, and in a responsible way. So I think we can, as I say, act as a force for good in that context.
Yeah, I think.
I'll put you on the spot, Sam.
Yes.
What if you identified a bad risk, either a couple of ships within a fleet or a bad fleet? Would you keep them on?
Well, it's difficult because I think you'd have to, again, a lawyer's answer, which I used to be in a former life, but how do you define a bad risk? Is a bad risk one that generates a lot of claims, or does it only become a bad risk where the premium's not sufficient to sustain them? That's the other point, and then you get into a sort of moral question about that. But ultimately, there have been owners where we haven't been satisfied with their operating standards, because ultimately the touchstone of mutuality is meeting a certain minimum operating standard, and ultimately if ship owners don't work with us to meet that standard, then they aren't going to continue to enjoy the benefit of the cover that ultimately is provided by their fellow ship owners in the mutual. It would completely undermine mutuality. But having said that, we would work with them to try and raise those standards in a collaborative way first.
Yeah, because I did wonder. You often see end-of-life ships kind of move. You can see them on the Lloyd's records. They start to move, between clubs and class societies, and then you find it's a non-IX member, and then it's a club you've never heard of, and they're just out there. I wonder if our path to net zero by 2050 is going to accelerate the flushing out of that tonnage into second, third life owners you can't find. Ostensibly, they're on a permanent state of scrapping. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to what your risk appetite is. And, you might decide that you have no risk appetite for scrap voyages whatsoever, from an environmental point of view, an ESG point of view. But also there are legal challenges, because you then have to grapple with the legal requirements to do with the transboundary movement and disposal of waste under the Basel Convention. So it's sort of thorny and problematic from an environmental perspective, and also from a legal perspective. But ultimately, the insurers provide P&I insurance cover for ship owners operating their ships within the confines of the law. It's a philosophical and perhaps a moral question as to how far you then take that beyond.
Is there still a link between ship size and the size of the claim?
If you look at the very large claims, the pool claims, the answer is that whilst the bigger ships have the potential to lead to bigger claims, there's not actually a direct correlation between the two. And the majority of those claims actually arise in ships up to somewhere around 50,000 GT. But the big ones make the headlines. The Ever Given, for example, the Golden Ray. And just mentioning car carriers, for example, the Golden Ray was a car carrier case, as people know. It made the headlines. It attracted a lot of attention. But actually, if you look at the impact of car carriers in terms of very large claims, it hasn't actually been as significant as other ship types.
Sure.
Like the containers.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. That was a fascinating discussion, and I don't think we do have any further questions, unless maybe one has just popped up. Oh yes, there's one last question, which we'll deal with and then wrap it up. The question is: Hi Sam, hope you're well. Do you think the current salvage and compensation regime is fit to cater for the likely future introduction of non-oil fuels like LNG, hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, or even nuclear with molten salt reactors? Is there any work going on to see how to cater for these future fuels, and what might a response look like?
Yes, Sam.
I was.
It's a very forward-looking question, and it is an excellent question, but I suspect that nobody yet has any experience of it, of course.
No, I mean, I suppose, sometimes in trying to see into the future, we peer into the darkness of the past. And I remember, coming up to 1st of January 2020 and the advent of IMO 2020, the reduction in sulfur content in fuel. We were all concerned about what that might mean in terms of casualties. Would it lead to a greater incidence of casualties and other types of claims? And actually, the shipping community was very good at responding to that. They had a long lead time in order to adapt, and they adapted very successfully. So the claims impact was very modest. I'm not an expert on the nuclear variant of fuel that you mentioned, or any of the other exotic things. But I mean, I suppose at a broader level of abstraction, that there is they present challenges for the industry to grapple with. On the low sulfur fuel, I know some work's been done scientifically to look at how that oil behaves, because would it be harder to clean up in the event of a spill, for example?
Sure.
My understanding is that no, it wouldn't be. So that that's another challenge. You've got could it affect the operation of a ship? Could that then lead to casualties? That's one point. And then secondly, if there were a casualty, how might that affect the response?
I think cryogenic fuels, probably not so much. You might get a localized effect, but most of that just woofs up into the atmosphere. Although, obviously, introducing LNG in quantity is a greenhouse gas. Bad news. Methanol's pretty nasty. And molten salt reactors are in a box about 7 meters square, and they're not pressurized. That's the beauty of it. So you don't get that Fukushima type, Chernobyl type accident where you've got horrible stuff squirting out under pressure in a plume. It stays in a box. But yeah, this will all be, hopefully, when we're farming llamas somewhere in Thailand. Yeah.
Keep tuning into the future. We can future we can revisit this.
We'll have another session.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much indeed for that answer. And I think that brings our session to an end. So I should say thank you very much to Nick and Rod and to Sam. I think that was excellent. I certainly enjoyed it very much. Marilyn has kindly flashed up the next sessions in our current set of shipping news on Thursday webinars. I'm actually speaking at the next one next week. I'm going to talk about carriage of containers on bulk carriers, given something which Rod touched on earlier. Rod mentioned $30,000 for a box, which I hadn't heard of, but that's an enormous amount of money, and you can understand why people would want to carry containers on bulk carriers. My talk is going to focus on the kind of charter party clauses which an owner would potentially want to include if they are going to carry containers on bulk carriers. And I will go through it from a legal perspective rather than from a technical perspective, although I have spoken to a few technical people previously. And then the next in the series after that is my colleague from London, Kirsty McHardy, who is going to talk about delay issues under shipbuilding contracts. I have less intimate knowledge of the precise nature of her talk, but I've certainly been experiencing a lot of COVID-related delays in shipbuilding contracts recently, and a lot of delays which would have happened anyway, but which have gone on for twice as long because of COVID, and it's been a massive exacerbating factor. So I hope that many of you will join us for both of those presentations. And in the meantime, thank you very much indeed for your attention today.